Good evening. Happy New Year and happy MLK Day. Thank you for attending the Atlanta Suburban Alumni Chapter Mental Health Monday series. Today, we will be discussing Roe versus Wade in your mental health. Today, we have our panelists are Alicia Thompson and Mr. Carl Christie. Tonight's session will be moderated by Jonquel Neal. Jonquel, I will turn it over to you.
All right. Thank you so much, Rashawn, and good evening, everyone. And I'll begin by introducing our panelists. I'll begin with Miss Alicia Thompson. She's a local government attorney at Fincher, Denmark, where she plays an instrumental role in her firm's transactional law team. She currently focuses her practice on contract, procurement, and employment law. Prior to joining Fincher, Denmark, Ms. Thompson practiced law as an associate attorney for the city of Atlanta, where she provided advice and counsel to various departments there. And prior to practicing law, she served the city of Atlanta in a financial capacity for 9 years as in the City of Atlanta's Capital Projects Division and Budget Office. Alicia was raised in the Metro Atlanta area and loves giving back to her community through being a member of Delta Sigma Theta, Sorority Incorporated, volunteering with the Georgia Association of Black Women Attorneys and the Gate City Bar Association, and enjoys spending time with her daughter, Aubria. Mr. Carl Christie, our second panelist, is a senior counsel with the Coca-Cola Corporation. Coca-Cola, of course, as you all know, is the most well-known brand worldwide. And he has more than 25 years of experience in the legal field. He initially worked as a legislative assistant to Senator Robb of Virginia, and also was a counsel on the House of Representatives Budget Committee for 4 years. He has also served as a deputy division chief with the city of Atlanta for 5 years. Advising clients in the Department of Finance, Procurement, Transportation, and Public Works, as well as the city of Atlanta pension funds. Carl was raised in Palo Alto, California, and currently resides in the Atlanta area. In his spare time, he enjoys running competitively in international travel with his wife. Dr. Nadia Barnett is an assistant professor of human services and psychology at Mercer University. She is our third panelist. For the past 18 years, she has balanced teaching and higher education in the areas of human services, psychology, and counseling, along with her clinical practice as a therapist, supervisor, and consultant. Her clinical experiences includes crisis assessment, inpatient and outpatient intake, group therapy, and individual counseling services in public and private settings. Her academic interests include wellness, self-care, burnout, human trafficking, as well as social justice. causes. She is also a member of Delta Sigma Theta sorority and takes pride in co-leading this webinar series. I would like to, of course, inform all of our wonderful guests that are tuning in today that we, of course, have some questions that we want to ask our panelists, but we encourage you all to please, in the question and answer portion of the Zoom portal, if you will, input your questions for our panelists for any additional topics that you'd like to discuss. First, I think we want to talk about just a little bit about the law. And I will turn this over either to Carl or Alicia. What is Roe v. Wade?
Okay. Thank you, Jonquil. And before I start, I'll just say that both me and Ms. Thompson are here in our individual capacities. So we're not speaking for our employers, that the opinions that you'll hear are ours only. And having said that, I'm going to try to be as objective as possible. I do have a pro-choice position myself, but I want to address the issues fairly. Now, to your question, what is Roe versus Wade? It's a 1973 Supreme Court case, which for the first time in American history established a nationwide right to an abortion. Prior to that, there was a patchwork, like different states had different rules. The Supreme Court in 73 said abortion is going to be legal with certain restrictions, and Ms. Thompson will get into those a little bit later. The decision itself was based on a prior case called Griswold versus Connecticut, which happened in 1965. And that case for the first time established that there is a constitutional right to privacy. And then Roe was an extension of that case, which said basically that privacy includes a woman having a right to choose what she does with her body, whether or not she desires to end a pregnancy or not.
And I'll add to that. Thank you, Carl. Some things that people might not know about Roe v. Wade, it was actually a class action lawsuit. So although the original petitioner was a Jane Roe, just like John Doe, this Jane Roe, it really also encompassed physicians that were being prosecuted for performing abortions. It dealt with women who also got abortions legally and illegally. It really wrapped up a whole class of individuals. And Mr. Chrissy mentioned a framework that Roe put in place. Once Roe was in place, the Supreme Court pretty much allowed the framework that was put in place. They called it the trimester framework. And in that first trimester, it said that abortion was going to be a decision between a woman and her doctor. In that second trimester, it put in place that states could restrict but not outright ban abortion. And then the third trimester is where states could really step in and regulate. So when Roe was passed, it really kind of turned things on its head because it gave an open door for the right to abortion.
All right, awesome. Thank you guys for that. So, the second question, it gets a little bit into how did the case get overturned, but if either of you can kind of just talk about the Dobbs case and the implications of that and what does that mean for Georgians? And I also will add in, I'm an attorney as well. And so my capacity here as a moderator will not serve as me giving legal advice, but certainly here to support the community and provide whatever information that we can while on this panel. And so, yes, if we can address just the Dobbs case and what are the implications for Georgians as we know it with what happened with that case.
Yeah, and thank you for bringing up Dobbs. I mean, that is the case that basically overturned. We're still saying Roe v. Wade, but now we're looking for Dobbs to be overturned. It's really Dobbs because 50 years after Roe, that is the case that overturned Roe v. Wade and really took abortion from a federal matter down back to the states. And so in those 50 years, if you can imagine, there were so many cases that actually that came before the Supreme Court, and Roe v. Wade was really hanging on by a very thin thread. I mean, the court was like 5-4, really up against the wire every time a case came before the court. And so in Dobbs, what that spoke to was, Dobbs was a case out of Mississippi. And the actual name of the case is Dobbs v. Jackson Women's Health Organization. And it's a 2018 case that addressed a law that was passed in Mississippi called the Gestational Age Act, which prohibited abortions after the 15-week mark. And that was actually the only question that the Supreme Court was supposed to be addressing, was if it was constitutional for the state of Mississippi to ban abortions at the 15-week mark. And the Supreme Court said, we're going to go a step further, and we're going to actually just take a look at the right of, to have an abortion. And you know what? It's not in the Constitution. There's no, that thou shalt have a right to abortion in the Constitution. So we're just going to completely send that back to the states. And so even though it started off, and that's all it really takes to overturn something like Roe v. Wade, of course, there are other factors that play a really huge, important part. The presidential power to appointing justices to the Supreme Court. You have to have the numbers. You have to have that conservative kind of pro-life majority that's going to decide in your favor. And, with the last 3 appointments to the Supreme Court by President Donald Trump, it all but assured that once the right case, which was Dobbs, came before the Supreme Court, that the right to abortion was going to be overturned. So that was something that we didn't expect in, 50 years in the making. So, yeah.
Yeah, and it's interesting, back in 1973, when Roe was decided, it wasn't really that much of a controversial issue. It was decided 7-2 by the Supreme Court back then. Over the years, conservative groups have kind of latched on to the being anti-abortion as a cause for them. And as a result, they pushed a lot of conservative presidents to appoint conservative justices. So like I said, we went from 7-2 in 1973, and there's another case that I guess we could bring up now that occurred in 1992 that severely, it limited the right to an abortion. It put a lot of limits on Roe, and that case was decided 5-4. And since that time, the Republicans have been trying to get a majority on the Supreme Court. When Justice Alito died during President Obama's term, Mitch McConnell refused to allow him to replace that justice with another one because he was worried that, it was Justice Scalia, not Alito. He was worried that Obama would shift the balance of the court in favor of pro-choice justices. So that appointment was made by Donald Trump, who appointed a pro-life justice. Justice Ginsburg died during Donald Trump's term, so that was an opportunity for another pro-life justice to be appointed. And then, of course, he's had the most recent appointment of Amy Coney Barrett, which shift the balance from 7-2 pro-choice to 6-3 anti-choice. Now, Justice Ketanji Jackson is in the pro-choice minority, and she replaced another pro-choice justice, Justice Breyer.
And I think it's a good point to mention that even when the 3 justices that President Trump appointed during their confirmation hearings, they were all asked, would they overturn Roe v. Wade? And they said no. And but we're here now. So, you do have to think about that conservative majority. And I think it just kind of ties to the point that, that it's our votes in play. This is how, voting can really impact our everyday life. It might seem far-fetched because the Supreme Court is this huge, court in Washington, D.C., and how can it impact us in our everyday lives? But because President Donald Trump was voted in office, and actually, I believe he said, Carl, correct me if I'm wrong, during his campaign that he was going to appoint justices to the Supreme Court, and that's what he did, and that's where we are today.
Right. With a few more votes the other way, we would have had President Clinton, and we would have had a 6-3 majority still in favor of Roe.
Yeah, that's simple. Yeah, you're right.
So what with the Dobbs case that has come along? So what does that mean for Georgians? Like, what options do they have, when they want to seek these specific, if they wanted to pursue an abortion or anything like that? What is that kind of left for the state for Georgians at this time?
Well, Georgia, after Dobbs was passed by the Supreme Court, Georgia went to a 6-week abortion ban. And that case was challenged and it was upheld by the Georgia Supreme Court. So now in Georgia, after 6 weeks, you can't get an abortion. I think, well, of course, the number one option is, for young people out there, women who can get pregnant, contraceptives, obviously. And related to that, there is a morning after pill. CVS and Walgreens are talking about making that available nationwide by mail order with a doctor's prescription. Now, I don't know if Georgia's going to ban out-of-state shipments of the morning after pill, but that's an alternative. There are a lot of large employers who are actually saying, if you live in a state and abortion is not available to you, we will pay to transport you to another state.
Mhm.
And finally, of course, action. There are states like California and New York that have their legislatures have put into place laws that protect a woman's right to an abortion, and it's in the state constitution. If, again, back to the voting thing, if more people voted, if we had Governor Abrams, if we had a state legislature that was controlled by Democrats instead of Republicans, we might have something like that in Georgia.
And I think we have to also recognize that the ruling put a really hard strain or heavy strain on low income and just marginalized communities, because those are the individuals that won't have the opportunity to, jump on a plane to New York or, spend, gas money to drive to the next state. So now you have low income individuals and just people that just might not have access to certain resources that are in a harder place now that the opportunity to have an abortion within the state of Georgia or whatever state they might be in, because some states have just outright banned abortion altogether. So it just makes it a lot harder on those communities.
And the crazy thing is too, there are certain states like Missouri, which is talking about making it a crime to go out of the state to get an abortion, even if you're going to a state where abortion is legal. Now, I don't think the Supreme Court would uphold that because there is in the Constitution a right to interstate travel, right to interstate commerce. But I mean, now that Dobbs has come down, a lot of states are running wild with it. And even in Congress, the Republicans are talking about possibly passing a law to ban abortion nationwide, or at least put limits on the amount of time that a woman can get an abortion. Again, it's one of those things, contact your member of Congress, make sure that they know that you're opposed to this. I don't think this will go anywhere because although the Republicans control the House, they don't control the Senate. And certainly President Biden would never sign anything like that. And on the flip side, we could encourage people to contact their representatives to pass a nationwide law allowing abortion. That's something that was talked about before the election. I don't know why the Democrats didn't do that when they had the chance, but it's certainly possible through the legislative process to put into law that there is a nationwide right to an abortion. You could have a law that's very similar to Roe versus Wade.
Sure. And I want to direct my next question just to Dr. Nadia Barnett. With these implications of, the lack of opportunity or availability of an abortion that will be available, I mean, how does this affect conversations that one has with their children or their sisters or their loved ones, when dealing with, when talking about, just with the potentiality of pregnancy, or if pregnancy does come about?
It makes the conversation very necessary now. Parents and loved ones need to begin having the conversation about sex and what responsibility comes along with that. They can use this historic change in the law to begin that conversation, and understanding how the laws are impacting what one can do with your body, the choices that a woman or a couple can make, and the limitations based on where you live. This is an opportunity to, for all women of childbearing age. So you think about young girls as old as 15 or 14 that have started their cycles, need to be educated about the responsibility of what happens to their bodies and choices that that they make. So it becomes imperative to have this conversation, even if you're a couple, an adult couple, a married couple, and you don't have conversations about childbirth, child care, family planning. This is an opportunity. Those adults that are engaged in several relationships that may include intimacy, this becomes a priority in conversation, where you don't want to find yourself stuck in a situation because of the state that you're in and the position that the state has, which may limit your choices in what you do with your body.
Awesome. And what about conversations with men in our lives? How does that affect the conversation?
Absolutely. The conversation is both ways for our young men as well, in the responsibility of being a part of a family that was not planned, and being a part of having that conversation with their partner, with what happens, and what are we going to do if this was to happen. And really it boils down to what Alicia and Carl mentioned earlier. What is your position at this point, and looking at all the factors that one would consider with being pregnant. And so it goes beyond just, okay, we're pregnant, but what do we want to do at this point? Because the time is going to be ticking. And as our panelists have indicated, time becomes a real important factor in being able to make a decision based on the state that you're in.
I see that we have a question from the audience, and this is to all the panelists. Do you feel that essentially the eradication, we'll just call it the eradication of the right to an abortion in Georgia as we stand here right now, do you think that this will cause individuals to potentially even travel out of the country?
Yes, and sorry if I could join in. That actually was happening prior to Roe v. Wade even being passed. Americans they had to leave the country to get an abortion. So if you will, I think the time. I don't think we're going to go completely back to the 60s, but I do think Americans will begin to find other ways and opportunities to secure their right. And I know we're talking about contraceptives and really making sure there's knowledge around that, but I do think that sex will not stop. So that's the really kind of sad thing about it, that abortions will still happen. It's just how they will happen now, whether they go out the country or whether it's done, elsewhere. So, yeah.
Okay, I wanted to answer that, and I wanted to jump into Nadia's point, about personal responsibility. I think we need to have state legislatures and Congress put up or shut up. It's like, if you think that abortion is such a bad thing, you want to get rid of it, have more money for childcare, have more money, have more resources out there. You can't have it both ways. You can't say, well, we don't want you to have an abortion, we are pro-life, but we don't want to pay for the life once it's around it. We need,
Right.
They'll pay to put you in prison, but they won't pay you to take care of you. They needs to be a comprehensive approach to life, to taking care of the life, should an abortion not be available. But to the point of traveling abroad, of course there will be states like California, New York, where abortions will be available. You may not necessarily have to go out of the country, but I think, to the point that Alicia made earlier, it's going to end up being something where if you have the money, you can have an abortion when you need it. But if you don't, you're stuck. Even before Dobbs came along, there were quite a few states where there was one abortion clinic in the entire state. So it was a right in practice, or in theory, but not in practice, that you had the options were limited. And this is just making it even worse.
Yeah.
Well, go ahead.
I thank you so much, Carl and Alicia, for sharing that. I want to add in terms of the the ability to get an abortion is included in the conversations that you have with your daughters and your sons, and looking at the resources that are available based on the circumstances is also important in that same conversation. Additionally, I can remember when abortions were not as welcoming as they are today, or excuse me, before the overturning of this law. And I had young women that were taking matters into their own hands and proceeding to do their own abortions, whether they are utilizing different things to stick up into their vagina to try to initiate a miscarriage. And those are the types of things that I'm hoping that if we talk more with and make this a normal conversation, an everyday conversation, when we're dating, when we're having sex, when we just need to educate, that people won't resort to doing those dangerous things. So that's my only last comment.
And one of the things was just interesting to me when the whole thing happened is that, okay, let's say, you do have your certain amount of states that will subsequently allow abortions, but when you only have a small amount of clinics or places in the country then there's no access for anyone, even regardless of what kind of financial position that you're in. Because if you can't get the abortion at a certain timetable, then it's not going to be available to you anymore. So it's, I think it's also going to come down to an access question, just generally speaking, once, if the numbers do begin to rise that need abortions, and the lack of facilities or availability of it just aren't there to meet the needs of the country.
And I recently did see that organizations like Planned Parenthood do have resources where if you need an abortion, you don't have it financially, you can reach out to them and they will help with your finances to either get you to the right place to have an abortion. I mean, and I've seen stories on the news where you have suburban moms and they're saying, my husband has a jet, I'm gonna, I'll lend it to, the local clinic, and they can, just advertise it and allow individuals to come and use it if needed for abortion. So I think there are also organizations and even just individuals out there that are seeing this need. And even though, money is not available to everyone, trying to make a way and an avenue for those individuals.
We have another question. It says, do we know if these rulings will eventually affect women's ability to retrieve certain contraceptives, such as birth control or even Plan B? And I think what the question means is essentially, how far is it going to go? You know what I mean? Are they just going to stop at abortion? I'll even take it a step further that some people have concerns about the future of IVF as a result of the overturning of the Dobbs case. So what are you guys' positions on that?
Well, actually the case that I talked about, which established the right to privacy, Griswold, in that case, it involved Connecticut law, which made it illegal for married couples to purchase contraceptives. And the Supreme Court overturned that, found the right to privacy. In the Dobbs case, Justice Thomas said that he thinks that the Griswold case should be reviewed and overturned. And he specifically mentioned he doesn't think that there should be a right to gay marriage, to gay sex, or to Griswold, to the right for couples to have contraception. So, in his mind, I think he would push that. And, it's kind of interesting to me that if you follow his logic about there being no right to privacy and turning this over to the states, you could ban interracial marriages. So his own marriage could be illegal, so I don't know if he thought about that. But yeah, I do think that with a lot of conservatives, there is an agenda to just shut down a lot of reproductive freedoms.
Agreed. I think, and you mentioned the word earlier, Jonquil, eradication. I think the goal is to honestly and to even to the point where Carl made about not being even able to travel outside your state to get an abortion. The goal is to literally eradicate abortion and anything like it from all of the United States. So it seems really far-fetched because that's not the world we were living in. Now we're kind of like living in that world. So it's really scary.
Someone, and I guess this kind of piggybacks off of the last question. Essentially, from what I can gather from this question is that, what about those, they have concerns potentially as it relates to those that use contraceptives for health reasons, not necessarily for purposes of preventing a pregnancy, but how would this type of case, if any at all, if Dobbs would address it at all, what would it have on the implications of that?
Well, I think fortunately we're not at that point yet. You know, if just in Justice Thomas's world, yeah, contraceptives probably would be illegal. But as it stands now, Dobbs is just strictly limited to allowing states to do what they want with abortion. They haven't addressed the matter of contraceptives.
Well, this is an interesting question from the audience. They'd like to know, the Dobbs case, how do women find hope and trust in our judicial system, with this type of ruling, and what kind of, and what does this mean for the credibility of the Supreme Court? That directly relates to what Alicia pointed out before, is that during their confirmation hearings, they testified that they wouldn't overturn Roe v. Wade, and then subsequently did.
Well, I think that the question is exactly correct, that court has no credibility. People, Alicia and I were talking about this before the call. Prior to Judge Bork in 1987, who went through his confirmation, people who were nominated would express their views freely, and the Senate would have an opportunity to know where they really stood on issues and then vote up or down. Judge Bork was a very conservative man, and he talked about what he would do if he were on the court. And the Democrats controlled the Senate, like, oh, no, we don't want you. And the Republicans learned their lesson. So basically after that, nobody will really give you an honest opinion of what they would do on the court, which is really a shame.
Yeah, and I think maybe the best way you could tackle it is just making sure you're voting for the right candidates, because those are the ones that are going to lead to the appointments that might be in your favor and that might impact your daily life. So maybe just making sure that you're voting for the candidates that you might trust to put someone on the Supreme Court that will stand by some of the decisions that you want to make in your life.
Or even, and I'll even go a step further, just locally, since, in the Dobbs case, they put it specifically back on the state. So each state has their own individual power to enact laws specifically as it relates to abortion. And Georgia decided that he already addressed kind of what Georgia went through as it relates to abortion, but we specifically vote for those in the legislature. And so, and those in the legislature have the ability to enact laws and to repeal laws. All right. And so, and essentially, if you're putting in the groundwork, grassroots organizing, you're vetting and investigating these candidates, what have they voted for in the past, all these things that we're able to find out about these candidates. And, then you can use that, and hopefully with electing the right people, but we've got to come out and vote. In the local elections, just traditionally, we're not voting. And specifically, this panel is not specifically about African-Americans, but African-Americans, since we are all African-American on this panel, we traditionally do not come out in large numbers in local elections to vote, and certainly not in runoff elections.
Yeah.
And so, we've got to really, put in the work to elect the right people that are going to, do the right things,
And
at least for us locally.
Absolutely. And on that point about locally, we have seen some of our leaders locally take a stance against abortion rights, although the state of Georgia is what it is, 6 weeks, and abortions are banned. But there were a number of DAs throughout the metro area that said that they announced that they were not going to prosecute women for abortion-related cases. And they just declined to use their office's resources to criminalize reproductive health decisions. In addition to that, you have a lot of local municipalities, cities, city councils are coming together and saying that they're going to request that their law enforcement agencies, that no funds be expended towards records and investigation reports towards, relating to abortion. And also requesting that the enforcement agencies make abortion-related issues at the least level of priority for the law enforcement agencies. And then you'll have some cities, I know the city of Atlanta donated $300,000 to the National Network of Abortion Funds. So they're supporting, abortion organizations through funds from the city. So there's a lot of things that's happening locally, and these are our local leaders, our mayors, our city council members, our DAs. They're the ones who are acting and taking action on a local level too.
And John Quell, to your point, I mean, when you vote for president, you're one of 300 million. When you vote for governor, Georgia, like one of 12 million. But if you vote at the local level, if you make your voice heard, Atlanta has 500,000 people. Stonecrest has at least like 10,000 people.
Mm-hmm.
You can really make a difference at your local level in getting this kind of legislation through, whereas your voice isn't going to be heard nationally or maybe statewide, but it will be locally for sure.
Yeah, and so we have some more questions coming in from the audience. So one, how the state that Georgia is in now, post-Dobbs, do you feel that this will prevent individuals from seeking prenatal care due to fear of their choices being limited? For example, if an expectant mother through testing is found out that her child will have birth defects, but then they fear they cannot terminate the pregnancy, what are your guys' position on that?
I think that's absolutely correct. I hadn't even thought about that, but yeah. I mean, not only that, just the idea of letting the authorities know you're pregnant. That's kind of like the clock is ticking, once you do that. So you might be reluctant to get prenatal care. I've heard that there are, pregnancy testing kits that will go online. You might be reluctant to do that because it's out there to the world. Okay, you got pregnant 3 weeks ago, so the clock is ticking. I mean, I think this is really going to have a dampening effect on women seeking the care they need for prenatal care.
Yeah, and I think that fear, I mean, it was something even as small, we talked about before, as our apps on our phones, like our, what's being tracked, and like, how do we know that, they know when we're, when we're in a position to, to be fertile and to have a baby. So it's just really scary to think that every area of our lives, we have to think about how this will impact it, but we have to. If we don't, we could end up in a position that we don't want to be in. So
we have some additional questions. This one, and I'm actually going to take this question a step further, but the panelists, this one question from the audience asks, do you believe that this issue goes further than just a pro-life versus pro-choice battle? Do you believe that race may play a role in this decision? And I'll even take a step further. Do you even think that population control plays a role in the recent decision?
Absolutely.
Yes.
The reason that conservatives have been pushing this for a long time is, they believe in this replacement theory and it's true. I mean, at some point there will be a majority of non-white people in this country. While there's a majority of white people in this country, a majority of the people who are getting abortions are white women. Mm-hmm. If you ban abortion, you're putting off that day, when whites will no longer be the majority, and that's the goal. Clearly, that's part of it. I mean, I think there are some people who sincerely have pro-life beliefs, but I think there are a lot of people who see this as a means of keeping white supremacy in place.
Yeah, and I agree. That was great. Yeah, I completely agree with that.
Nadia, this question is for you. From the nature of your practice, since the Dobbs decision, have you seen any mental health ramifications consequential from the ruling?
Not yet. In your personal life, so family members would probably see it first because of the time factor. Medical professionals would then be the next step if due to any medical concerns that come up. I think in the mental health space, we would see it, or we would see residual effects after the fact. So as a result of, if a young woman wasn't able to make a decision about having a baby and is forced to have a baby and is experiencing anxiety and depression related to that, if the changing dynamics of family as it relates to a birth that was completely unplanned and forced upon, I would think that possibly with medical professionals speaking more towards emergency room setting, urgent care setting, as it relates to those that may take things into their own hands, or if they travel to other states or out of the country to get procedures done and need some medical care after the fact. So please, parents, loved ones, this is something to be on the lookout. School counselors, this is something to be aware of. Teachers, as young children may confide in those they trust about their situation. So it may not directly come to the mental health space until after the fact. Or if a young woman has had an abortion before and is struggling with being in a situation, a similar situation again.
And this is an interesting question. Initially, Dr. Barnett, when you were initially talking, you were saying that this makes the abortion conversation with our children very necessary. It's interesting because as a generational thing, there was always a preaching of abstinence, and there traditionally, at least in African-American households, of not discussing abortions because you were supposed to be abstinent in the first place. And so, with how times have evolved, right? And with the recent decision, how does that affect the abstinence talk? And what advice do you give to parents who, maybe never foresaw themselves even having a conversation with abortion with their children? How do you foresee that going now? And what are your tips for them?
Well, I will say the abstinence position in schools seems to be the direction that schools want to go, but realistically, as parents, taking responsibility for being aware of what your child is engaged in doing, and if they're not doing anything, even having a discussion about how government impacts how we behave would be where it begins, whether we're talking about abortion or whether we're talking about stealing. There are laws that are in place to govern how we behave, and that could be the place to begin the conversation with your child, or as a teacher to, if you are mentoring young individuals, that could be the place to begin the conversation. And in governing behaviors, there are consequences for your actions. And one of the consequences could be that you could get pregnant and not be able to have the choice to have an abortion if you choose. The other piece of it, I would say, is in talking about abstinence, I would hope that the other side of it is also discussed in having sex and talking about what that means in terms of personal responsibility, being safe, what are the things you do to be safe? What are the types of conversations that you have with someone who you may want to engage in intimacy or sexual activity? What are those questions that you ask? I think we are, as you mentioned, we're beyond the times of not asking questions because we feel embarrassed. I think asking questions about, the health risks that may be in place or put someone at risk, talking about contraceptive, talking about what is your responsibility in engaging in sexual activity, how to have that conversation, and being able to be open about it. The more open we can be, I think the better. The more that you can have a great, not great, but the more you can have a one-on-one true relationship with your child, with the person that you love, the more that they will come to you when they're in trouble, when they will come to you if they find themselves, or if they find a friend in a situation where time is of the essence. And that's the urgency of this matter. It's gone are the days where you can be pregnant and hide from it for 2 months. We are not in that life anymore, and we have to make the transition before people begin to do things that are not in their best interest, or make decisions that are not in their best interest for their health as well.
Someone did ask a question about, well, one, I do want to go back to you, Dr. Barnett. How does this affect our romantic relationships, if at all?
It brings it to the forefront. If you're in a significant relation, you have a significant relationship with someone, and you are engaging in unprotected sex, this should be a topic of conversation. What are we going to do if this were to happen? Should we begin to use contraceptives? Should we begin to do some other things to prevent getting pregnant, or having the conversation, if we get pregnant, what are we going to do? Hopefully it will, conversations like this can bring about more intimate connection. So that could be a benefit. The closeness of having a very vulnerable and open conversation can be helpful with your romantic partner. And also just being aware and understanding where, depending on where you live, because this webinar is open for anyone, anywhere. And so depending on where you live, being educated on what rights you have in your state, and that becomes also a part of the conversation. So it can be a benefit to help bring you closer, as well as for parents as well. You can become close with your child by having more open adult conversations if they're going to engage in very adult behaviors that have pros and cons.
Someone from the audience asked, they want to know, did Dobbs spell out any exceptions for abortions, or did they specifically leave it to the states?
Yeah, it's completely up to the states now.
Yeah, it's and Carl, as we were talking about it, it just really didn't even click in my head until I said it a couple of times. Like, abortion is now a state issue. It's no longer a question for a federal court. So to even think about what it would take to bring it back before the Supreme Court is, something that I haven't wrapped my head around yet. But because right now, as Carl mentioned earlier on in the conversation, we know state issues go to the Supreme Courts in those particular states. So, and federal issues go to the Supreme Court of the United States. So yeah, it's completely in the states.
And for anyone that's seeking any literature out there about the success mortality rates of, I guess, for the expectant mother of abortions for out of the country, Dr. Barnett, do you know anywhere that they could seek, or should they speak to their gynecologist about that, or what would be the best place for them to go?
Absolutely. The gynecologist would be a great medical professional to ask. And we would normally have one on right now, but she had an emergency. But I would think that it would be too soon to really see the effects of abortions being done out of the country. And if in another 5 years, we may have more research to really look at that. And you can pair this with the idea of people that go out of the country for other medical procedures, and how long it takes to really get that research to one, understand the benefits and the risks that are associated with that. So right now, I think it's a little bit too soon. I could imagine that in other countries where religion and abortion do not align, that those would be places that would not have this available. So we will just have to wait and see for that. But that's a risk that someone who would have the resources, as mentioned earlier, to be able to do. And more than likely for those, the population where they may not have the resources, they're going to seek other options.
Yeah, and I just want to add that, can you hear me? I'm sorry.
Yes,
Okay, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, I just wanted to add that I know in the 1960s, people were going to countries like Sweden and maybe the UK. I'm not sure of what their abortion laws honestly are, but countries like that, I think, that are a little bit more open to abortion and the right to have that abortion. Yeah.
One of the things I did want to add also, I think someone asked some questions about Planned Parenthood. If you go to their website, what they will, if anyone is seeking out financial assistance for abortions or anything like that, they will still help you and guide you to, even if your state doesn't have any options, they can guide you to financial options. Planned Parenthood also has a state-by-state guideline of essentially what you can and can't, what their up-to-date abortion laws are in that particular state, for which state you reside in. And so another question from the audience is, how do you think that this will affect, how, if any, does this affect adoptions and public assistance?
That's a good question. As far as public assistance goes, there has been, for years, there's something called the Hyde Amendment, which has been in place, which has prohibited Medicaid funding of abortion. So that's on the table. But, to my earlier point, I just don't know that states or localities are going to come up with more money for childcare. Certainly by banning abortion, there will be more children available for adoption. There is a federal adoption tax credit, and hopefully people will take advantage of that. But I just don't know if we're going to see any more resources on the national, state, or local level for people who do have unplanned pregnancies and decide to keep the child for whatever reason.
I will say, I will add just for the panel on Planned Parenthood's website, not from any opinions of my own, that in Georgia, some of the exceptions that you could potentially qualify for if you are past the 6 weeks mark of pregnancy include in order to save the mother's life, to preserve the pregnant person's physical health, if the fetus is not expected to survive the pregnancy, and if the pregnancy is a result of rape or incest. And so essentially, of course, you would have to qualify for that individually. It's not going to be just because you read that on Planned Parenthood's website that you will automatically qualify, but I'm sure it's a case by case basis. But just to kind of answer the question specifically for the info on Georgia.
And it's kind of interesting to that point. For a long time, a lot of pro-life people said they were against abortion, except in the cases of rape, threat to the health of the mother, or and now they've narrowed health not to include mental health, because before there was talk that, this could be for women who may have mental health issues, or just in general, that might be a reason to terminate the pregnancy. As you see in Georgia, they've gotten rid of that. It's physical health. They don't really care what happens with your mental health.
And let me say, as it relates to mental health and pregnancy, there are some medications that women who are pregnant cannot take. So what happens most oftentimes, women that are in mental health treatment, that are on medications and get pregnant, they come off of their medications. So just put that in perspective. You have someone who for their best functioning, they've been prescribed something, they're being treated, but because they're pregnant, they come off of it, and the risk that for themselves and their child. So along those same lines.
And I think that that was such a major, major, major point. Ever since the pandemic, it was even before the pandemic, but that the country really went into a mental health crisis during the pandemic. And we have seen so many suicides and so many mental health diagnoses and undiagnosed behavior that we are all have been observing over the past few years. And that's just so interesting that you brought that up. That is a very, very important question. And I think that deserves to be carved out as an exception, certainly. So that's very interesting. That'll be interesting to see what our legislators do going forward.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think that as long as the state's in Republican control, they're happy with it the way it is, to be honest. Get out and vote. I can't.
Yeah, that's the best we can definitely tell you to do.
Yeah.
Your voice matters, especially now. Yeah.
Absolutely. And related to mental health, we're gonna see changes in the people around us before the professionals do. So we want to, keep your eyes and ears open. And when something doesn't sound right, it probably isn't.
So we have a question. This says, from a healthcare perspective, there's been an increase in the utilization of safe haven laws across all states. Do you foresee a continued increase due to this ruling? Can you guys hear me?
We hear you. I don't know if anybody, I don't have an answer for that one.
Oh, okay.
I would assume, and someone getting to the point of giving birth, that could definitely be something of impact. Those situations would be giving birth in not a hospital environment. And so that's just something else for us to be aware of and to be on the lookout for as we are hearing reports that come in across the state and across the nation.
I mean, I definitely can say, just from my perspective, I could foresee an uptick in people dropping off their newborns. I mean, if you're taking away their ability to terminate an unwanted pregnancy, and if they are not willing to, or just didn't have the options of going through with an adoption process or foster home or anything of the sort, then I can see there being an uptick in, especially if you have a lot of younger mothers going through pregnancy or whichever ages that they are. So I can definitely foresee with you taking away the ability to terminate an unwanted pregnancy with them, thereby dropping their children off. So I think that that's just going to be a necessary consequence.
And and along those same lines, Carl mentioned about resources on the other end. I think the idea that I'm for we need resources on the other end if we're saying that, we don't want women to have abortions, but on the other end, we don't want to take care of them. But in reality, as a taxpayer, we end up taking care of them because whether individuals who give their child up for adoption, whether the child is, they're utilizing the safe haven law to give their child away, or whether, a young woman just continues to have babies, the resources that person or that child will need is still going to come from taxpayer dollars that aren't being allocated in a more effective way.
I see from where I have, As it relates to, kind of we've been talking about, at this point, we've talked about kind of the constitutional framework of kind of how Roe v. Wade was before, and then how the Dobbs case has kind of shaped the legal framework as where it stands right now. Just from, are there any kind of takeaway points or anything that each of you want to add, just, in totality from what we've all been discussing tonight?
Well, I think, to sum up, elections matter. Regardless of what a person says when they're going to get confirmed on the court, the person who nominates them has a pretty good idea how they're going to stand. So, if you want people who are going to be pro-choice, vote for a president who's pro-choice. If you don't, then vote for someone who isn't. But, you need to just be aware that by not voting, you're making a choice too. You're putting in the hands of someone else a decision that could affect your life. And we see where we are now. I mean, for so many years, you heard groups like Planned Parenthood, just stressing, it's really important to vote. And I think people didn't take that seriously. And look where we are now. So just as Roe was overturned, there could be in the future a case or maybe a national law to reinstate abortion rights nationwide if people participate in the electoral process.
Yeah, and I think that's my takeaway to vote. We didn't really talk about this, but I mean, the Supreme Court justices that were put on the bench are fairly young. So we gave someone the power to give really to have a conservative court for maybe 20 or 30 years, in the future. And I'm not saying that's how long we'll be without a right to an abortion. But right now, as the court stands, is a fairly young court, and they're in place because they were appointed and given the power by a president who believed in the right to, that had a pro-life agenda. So, just whatever you do, think about the next thing that it'll impact. I know we're talking about all these kind of things that could pop up, safe haven laws and adoption, and it's almost like this just set everything off. It just kind of, it's a domino effect and just kind of set every other thing in our society off. So the best we can do is tell you to go and vote.
I do see this is another question about the safe haven laws. Do we think that they'll give mothers or parents additional time to drop off their children? That immunity that they have from dropping off their children, do we think that they will potentially increase the amount of days that they have to drop off a newborn in a safe haven due to the Dobbs decision?
Honestly, I think that a lot of conservatives, having gotten what they wanted, they haven't really thought about the implications. So again, I think this is another thing where it's important for people to make their voices heard and express the view that we want a longer time for safe haven laws. Because that's why I said earlier, I didn't really have an opinion. I don't think that anybody has really considered that implication as a consequence of the Dobbs ruling.
In Georgia, more than likely, no. I don't. Maybe move to New York or California, you might, have a better chance there. But I don't know about Georgia. I don't trust it.
I do see that we have another question as it relates to the legislature in Georgia. How long do they think it would take? How long does everyone think it'll take for them to possibly overturn, the ability to have an abortion? I mean, that can take any amount of time.
But you know what I will say? We've seen that Georgia's becoming more blue. We have two
That's
Democratic
true.
senators. And, I think it won't be terribly long. It may be in the next decade or so where we'll see consistently having Democratic governors and a Democratic legislature because the demographics in Georgia have changed. So things will change. I mean, if you want to wait 10 years, that's fine. But, things can happen earlier if you take action now and vote.
Yeah, agreed. Anything can happen. Like Carl said, we already have we've won a couple, the Democrats have won a couple, statewide races. So anything can happen. Absolutely.
And just for the purposes of the audience, so the safe haven laws is essentially a situation where a baby would a parent would drop off their baby at a hospital or a fire station. That's what we were referring to with the safe haven laws. All right. Dr. Barnett, I will turn it over to you at this point. Do we have any more questions? Okay, we do have another question in here. Are there any key things that voters need to tune into when the upcoming election cycles so that they can be better prepared?
Yes, I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if the General Assembly puts something on the ballot to completely ban abortion. So be on the lookout for that. But on the flip side, if you pressure your lawmaker, to maybe introduce legislation that would put a referendum on the ballot to allow abortions, something like that might happen too. But I think because this is such a hot topic, come November of next year, I think we'll see something on the ballot.
So thank you so much, everyone, for joining this amazing session. Please feel free to provide us with an evaluation. We actually have the job form in the chat box for you all to fill out. Dr. Barnett or anyone else, is there any closing remarks as it relates as the panelists that you all would like to make?
Yes, I will just, hope that this conversation, which is why it's a topic, even though for some it may seem off from mental health, but it's definitely connected to our relationships that we have with those that we love and the kinds of decisions and consequences that we are going to support our loved ones in, and this is one of them. And so hopefully those that are here that have, as I said, are mentors or they have children, they will utilize this information to educate others and also open the door for conversations as it relates to how the laws impact and govern our behaviors, which is general. That's one of my tips, is kind of really starting general when you're talking with young teenagers and young adults, but then you can really get specific to, let's talk about what this means and what it means for you, and open the door for the conversations that the school systems don't want to have, that we are going to be responsible for having with our children, and even those children that are those of us that have college age students, our young adults. This topic and all the topics that we have covered just in this conversation, I hope that we all can share. If you have any questions, we can take the next few minutes to address them in the Q&A function. But that is kind of my spiel that I would give right now. So.
All
And
right.
I'd like to say, just
Go
thank you
ahead,
for,
Carol. I'm so sorry.
thank you for letting me join this panel. I would completely echo what Nadia says. It's scary hearing Roe versus Wade was overturned. And I think a lot of people don't know what exactly the implications of that are, what it means. And I hope that everybody who's participated will share this information with the people they know so that it'll make things a little clearer. In some ways, having Roe overturned isn't as bad as what people think, but in some ways it's worse. So I think it's important for people to be educated on the implications and what they need to do to live their lives as the best they can since Roe's been overturned.
And let me, I've been sitting here wondering if I should share this. I have as a middle school child, I had a friend who actually did get pregnant in middle school. And, you know, this was before there were stipulations on age limits and the abortion and things of that nature and accessibility. And I can just remember my friend telling me that she used a hanger and to stick it into her vagina to cause to tear up everything in there so that she could have a miscarriage. And that experience stuck with me even till today, which was why this is important, because I wonder if she had someone that she could talk to. I wonder if there was more conversations at that time from this in the school, in her community, about options, and she was not, and we're talking about in the 80s. This was not the first time I had heard about this. There are women that have caused significant damage to themselves just by wanting to get rid of a pregnancy. And I just hope that we are not going back to those times. And I hope that having more, bringing more awareness to this as a consequence of our actions will be helpful and hopefully save some women some physical in their physical health as well as their mental health. So I know that may have been really explicit, but that's intentional. This topic is very explicit and it's very personal. And, the more that we are afraid of having these explicit personal conversations, the more that we're going to see tragedies occur because of it.
Yeah, there's a really good documentary on HBO, I believe it is, called The Janes. And have you seen, I don't know if you saw it, Jonquel, and it was really good because it's an eye opener, like pre-Roe, what young women had to go through to give themselves abortions or, kind of go through like a kind of like a black market just to get an abortion. And it was, groups that you would even think of that, you would think usually deal in like crime or drugs, they were doing abortions because women needed it. And that was a need, and they answered the need. So, and women were running to, running everywhere, looking for someone to give them an abortion or taking it into their own hands. And, they said the emergency room, I think it's called a septic pregnancy or abortion or something like that. And they said the ER was full of those young ladies who were going through that. So that's a really good documentary. And it's horrible that, women had to kind of take matters into their own hands, and whether they came out, well or not, it's just horrible that we even have to consider that. And I think another documentary I was watching, and this was pre-Roe as well, it talked about, and women were really voicing that, as soon as I got pregnant, I became a criminal. Like now my pregnancy has made me, almost like wanted by the government. And that shouldn't be how we should feel when, when we're dealing with our own reproductive health. It should be our choice, our bodies, what matters to us. So check out I literally have just Googled, documentaries on abortions. There are some really good documentaries on all the streaming channels. I just named like one or two, but yeah, it's really good history out there on abortions and what the country looked like pre-Roe.
And I've posted a link in the chat. Thank you, Alicia, for that.
All right. I think that we're going to turn this over to Ms. Rashawn, or we turn it over to Janelle.
We have one more question in the Q&A.
Okay. Let me take a look. So someone posted that they've seen on the news concerning technology to track cycles, I guess your menstrual cycle. Do you think that this is more of a concern now? I'm not quite sure.
I mentioned that before because I know that I didn't base it on any research that I've done, so let me not speak from any app as an app creator or any or technology researcher. But I know that's, I mean, all these things come into question, even down to when we put in the cycle for our periods, who's going to see that and what are they going to think, if they see that, if they have access to that information, and what am I signing away when I click on the accept all conditions and privacies in some of these apps, and they take this information from us. So it's very scary to think about. Again, haven't researched it, and I'm not a tech professional, but it's something to think about.
I think, before we had these apps and these high-tech cell phones, it was a good old mark it down on a calendar. I think it still becomes a responsibility of teaching our young women how to keep track on your own. If you feel that you don't want to put you don't want to mark it down in your app, still it's your responsibility to keep track for yourself, so that you can know where you are in your monthly development. And so that should be a part of the conversation for both boys and girls of that age, with regards to our bodies and what's happening, and being aware of the threshold of when conception is highly likely, and really paying attention to what's happening with our bodies as well.
All right. Well, we want to thank our panelists for being here this evening. You've provided such amazing information on our reproductive rights as women, and just kind of what the state of Georgia is as it relates post Roe v. Wade and post Dobbs. And Sora Janella will be closing us out. Thank you guys so much.
Hi, another phenomenal and informative discussion tonight at the Atlanta Suburban Alumni Chapter of Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated's Mental Health Monday series, Roe v. Wade and your mental health. And just real quick, I know I'm supposed to be closing, but I did see the James. I am a gynecologist. I did see the James, and it was very, very good. It's on HBO Max. And it really does, when you brought up what a septic abortion is when, to be septic is when you get bacteria in your bloodstream. So with women doing whatever, going whatever, they had a whole floor of women who were sick and dying from septic abortions. As soon as Roe v. Wade passed, closed down. And it takes place in Chicago, and it's a documentary, it's phenomenal. And it does give you a picture of how it will be again if we don't do if something doesn't happen. But thank you.
Janella, can I ask you a quick question? As a gynecologist, or have you seen any influx of this issue on your end?
Not quite yet, too much. I try my best to educate. We all know education is number one. But when people are in the office, compared to once they step out and their world is at their feet, whatever's happening in their world, they forget. And the apps are good because it does keep you aware, but I understand the concern with Big Brother watching. And so I definitely agree with you, Nadia, a good old paper calendar that you can burn if you need to. But please keep up with your cycles. It's so important. It gives you that awareness that, okay, this is a time something can happen. I need to be, definitely more careful. But yeah, it is kind of concerning that is Big Brother watching. Are they being that attentive to the hundreds of millions of women out there? Who knows? But Plan B is still available, and if you as soon as you mess up, just take the Plan B. You don't have to wait for a missed period to take Plan B. It has to be within 72 hours anyway. So Plan B is still available. Okay.
Thank you so much for that. And I want to just re-emphasize, please make sure you're having conversations with our men and our women, our boys and our girls. We don't want to have to just focus on women or girls. This is a conversation and an issue for all of us.
Definitely. Well, thank you, attorneys Carl Christie, Sir Alicia Thompson, and Sir Jaquel Neal for moderating. Are we still here? I think I hit something. And definitely our Mental Health Mondays chair, Dr. Nadia Barnett. Also, thank you to our physical mental health chair, Sir Rashawn Mitchell-Jefferson, my co-chair, Dr. Cherie Hill, and our Madam President, Sabrina Clark. And most of all, to you, the audience, for joining us and listening on this Martin Luther King Jr. Day on, not off. Our next Mental Health Monday is March 20th. Please follow us on our social media sites for the exciting details. You do not want to miss it. Please, we look forward to you joining us and hopefully inviting someone. Have a good night and a safe night as well.